found an outlet in this game. I think the thing we have to mention, of course, is we're not quite sure what rules the game might have been played. At that point it wasn't laws yet, because they sometimes had to agree on what the format of the game was going to be that they were going to be played, but they knew how to challenge each other, and in a very short time they were able to play against a touring side and understand the rules of the day. I went down to have a look at the hole itself, and I had this fascinating thought come in my mind of all those ropes like a spider's web, and who was George Moor? Had he worked down there? Did he dangle from one of those ropes and dig in that rock? What position did he play? But he certainly seemed to know something about rugby and seemed to have an idea that the cup that was made, that ended up in KwaZulu-Natal, had some future attached to it.
The spirit of adventure must have been quite incredible, and George Moor, by all accounts, was a miner who fell ill and then had to go to Durban, and then they came back to play here in Kimberley.
Yeah, and what we've learned being in Kimberley, it was at this amazing intersection of history. There was so much else happening in Kimberley, in the rest of the world, that around those late 1800s and into the early 1900s, when this game took hold, when all the stuff was happening that resulted in De Beers Consolidated Mining being formed. But we've seen that, at that point, there was no telephone. It says something that a cup like this has reappeared, because when you sit down and analyze the world of sport, there are these amazing trophies that are part of the folklore of almost every game in the world, and we tend to forget about them, yet they really focus our attention at that moment when they played for.
Well, I think history is such a huge and valuable part of our lives, and I must say, Dan, it's been a real privilege to be here today.
For me, if there's anything that has come out of this trip to the city with a hole in it, it's the wonderful phrase that you reminded me of earlier, is that it's about the past. Without your past, without respect for your past, you have nothing to build on.
Leaving Kimberley, it left me with a deeper understanding of the intriguing history attached to this trophy, and how it became part of contributing the emergence of the game in those times, and of course the modern game as we know it today. The invaluable information unearthed with Dan and Hugh on this trip has shown us this. The hallmarks pointed to its manufacture from Birmingham in 1873, making it the oldest trophy in world rugby. The Currie Cup also originated in Kimberley, and we highlighted the massive role Griquas has played in the history of South African rugby. And the question still remains, who exactly was George Moor, and where did the trophy disappear to for 81 years? Cape Town has always been known as the home of South African rugby, which makes it our next destination. A little known fact about the Moor Cup is that it was originally planned for the Cape of Good Hope, to be used as the trophy for the Grand Challenge. Quite ironic then that it now makes its way there 135 years later, the 81-year disappearance of the Cup being the reason it was possibly replaced. Hamilton Sea Point Rugby Football Club, affectionately known as Hammies, is unquestionably the oldest club in South Africa, and perhaps it's why the Moor Cup was originally meant to come to the Ferris Cape, as rugby was being played as an official sport there at that time. Founded in 1875 by Scot Walter Nightingale, and named after the club in Scotland he was part of by the same name, and born out of necessity for more structure in the game at the time. Hammies, as it's known by, has remained a tour de force in club rugby to this day. The traditions set up in those far-off times are today the basis which much of the club's success rests. It was the early 1860s when the game was first introduced to the Western Cape schools by the principal of Bishop. But here again, there have always been conflicting reports on the subject of what code of rugby football was being played, as the famous South African rugby historian Paul Dobson points out.
I think what we've just got to be clear in our minds is that there was a game called football, which had many, many forms, as it does now. But then, of course, far more. So each school would have a different form. In those schools, they would play it differently each time they played it. So there was no such thing as a set form of football. And certainly in 1861, where I think bishops became the first people to start playing a sort of football here. And they based it on the Winchester game because that's where Canon Ogilvy had gone to school. Whatever games were played were only your version of it. There was no game called soccer. The Football Association was founded in 1863. The Rugby Union was founded, Rugby Football Union, it was Football Union, in 1871. So those games were football. And whatever shape or form they had, it wouldn't bear resemblance to rugby football as we know it. Rugby is always, or rugby football's flourished, where you've had a conglomeration of physically active males, blokes with a lot of testosterone to spare. And so it was in like army units, educational establishments, and in South Africa on the mines. In the schools, they then formed a game that would, as I say, vary from day to day, let alone from school to school, based on whatever ground they had available. So at Eton you've got the wall game, because it's played next to the wall, and you've got the field game, which is played over acres.
The game, which very roughly speaking is a cross between soccer and rugby football, is fast, sometimes furious, and always tough. We are reliably informed that it may take years to learn all the rules, so we won't delve too deeply into them.
At rugby school they had the close, and that became the shape of the rugby ground really, that long rectangle. There the game changed in that instead of taking the object back to your own house and they're killing it, they started to take it forward. But they put a whole lot of the new boys, the fags, would be in the goal. And that packed the goal, so it was very hard to score a goal. So they then extended the length of the goal. And if you got into that area and you killed the ball, which was the old thing, you grounded it by killing it, you rubbed it in the dirt, you then got the opportunity to try to improve it, to convert it into a goal. And the goal was what won the game. And then later on, much later on, in 1846 really, they produced the uprights of the post. They made the H-shaped post. So then you suddenly had the story of William Webb Ellis, this fine public school boy in the fair, in the bright air, who became a clergyman. He was all things honourable, and he picked up the ball and ran with it, which is probably myth.
Following my discussion with Paul Dobson, I found myself requiring a bit more insight into the first games played in the Western Cape. Dave Kagan from Hammies brought up the subject of the first recorded game played in 1862. In truth, as Paul Dobson had pointed out, there can be no specific date or official record of the first game being played, as in essence, there were just too many codes being played at the time. We are on our way to meet Dave Kagan, the president of the Hamilton's Rugby Football Club, to discuss the origins of the game, the first game that was ever played, and hopefully we can come to a conclusion of just where the first game of rugby was played. Nice to see you again. And here's the cup that should have been played for in the Western Cape.
We've been waiting a long time for this, since 1876.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Josh. Wow, unbelievable. And look at the condition as well. Just remember when Reverend Canon George Ogilvy came out. He was eventually the principal of Bishops, Dyson College, and he came out as principal in 1861. He actually came here in 1858. Now there was a form of football played before, Just remember, there was no rugby at that stage in South Africa. It was a form of football, and he'd brought it over from Winchester, where he had been a pupil. And although he developed his own form of the Winchester rule of football, they would come out here, they would play it amongst the military, the civilians, and what they called Gog's ball. And that was Gog's, Josh Morris, because the only part of his signature that they could make out was Gog. So therefore, he was nicknamed Gog. What best way to equate it would be to say that sumo wrestlers would be better suited to have played the game. There was a big ball, a big round ball that they passed from chest to chest. It was a bit of hacking, which was kicking. But as I've said, that game was Gog's ball, and that's how it was played. That was in the 1860s, and in fact 1862 is the first part of history that we can actually find that is documented. In fact, funny enough, Vincent van der Bijl, your Natal fast bowler, he was the great-great-great-grandson of the gentleman Adrian van der Bijl, who kicked the first football in 1862 at Greenpoint. That was the first game between the military, which was the 11th Regiment, and the civilians. When, however, after 1878, the game of rugby was chosen, you will find that very consequential is that in 1883, when the Western Province Rugby Football Union was for the first time came into being, you will find that the Diocesan College, in other words bishops, was not part of that group of players or teams that played it. Leading up to 1883, although the game of rugby was being played, there were no uniform set of rules. And that is when, led by the Hamilton Club, we actually decided that the clubs had to get together, have a uniform set of rules, get selectors to pick the colonial sides, as also get a Grand Challenge trophy, as they called it, and then they went out, bought the cup, had set rules, and from then on, the challenge was played first on a knockout basis, but thereafter the Grand Challenge has been played for ever since.
Further investigation took me to the Villager Football Club, founded in 1876, who also played a major role in the club game in the Western Cape. John Gainsford and Bossy Clark enlightened us on the new direction that villagers were taking, looking to the future.
Let's just talk about the importance of the club game and how it's all been lost in the bigger picture of South African rugby, because I've always believed that club rugby is the heartbeat of the game, and we seem to have been lost in a time warp with club rugby.
Very much so. In fact, what's happened this year at Villages, we've decided not to pay players, and we think that's the right way to go. We'll be the pioneers club side to see whether this can work, and we really do believe it will work, because I mean it's made our budget less by 800,000 Rand a year that we're going to collect, and we're saying that maybe we'll collect the same money but put the money back into the club in another way and make people and players more happy. But if we just go back a few years, I don't quite know why it hasn't happened these days, John, where club rugby was played at Newlands. You'd have 3 games on the A field and you'd have 3 games on the B field. The teams would get together afterwards in the players' bar, and there'd be great camaraderie, and I think that's where this whole thing about club rugby is also lost, because that camaraderie's gone. You know, we're playing at home, so you have isolated 2 teams playing and playing in very sparse areas. You know, it's like...
From that point of view, the club now are going to have people and players that want to play for the club, that want to wear the tie, that want to be involved, and they're coming here out of sheer joy of rugby and playing for the club. And that's what it used to be like, and that's what we're trying to encourage to get back to.
With my time in Cape Town drawing to a close, what stood out for me was seeing the passion the Cape clubs have for the game, and the strong connection they have to not only their history, but the origins of the game. And it made me realize just why it is considered the hub of South African rugby. As our journey nears its end, it has certainly highlighted the fact that this remarkable piece of silverware has had an incredible part to play in the history of South African rugby. It has travelled through time parallel to the history of our country and seen the evolution of the game from its very beginning into the modern era of today. When one considers it has survived the Boer War and 2 world wars, it's conceivable that it could be the very reason for it going missing for 81 years. However, that tale will remain forever an unsolved piece of its history. When one looks back in time and talks to past players from the great clubs around the province that participated and fought many battles for the grand old trophy, you do get a sense of pride from these players of yesteryear who are all astutely aware how the modern game has changed.
Now the healthy state of Moor Cup rugby in the late 70s, right